From the crossroads of the Ozarks, this is PID Radio. Welcome. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I am Sharon Gilbert, and welcome to our humble bunker, everybody. We are delighted this morning. It's not just the two of us blathering. You get to hear from two actual experts in the fields of archaeology and anthropology, and I'll tell you what, these are fine, fine gentlemen.
We are honored to call them our friends, and honored to even more so to call them our travel companions later this year. We'll tell you about that during this program. First, gentleman who's been out in the field recently. He was in Turkey not that long ago, part of the team documented in the film narrated by Gary Sinise, Finding Noah.
Oh, yeah.
And also part of the team that discovered the most recent scroll cave at Qumran. Author of the new book, Guardians of Göbekli.
Which I've read. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron, welcome.
Thank you, guys. Good to be here.
And our friend who we lovingly refer to as our friendly neighborhood PhD. He's the founder and director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, where you too can study monsterology from a Christian perspective. Author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
We're going to talk about this site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe that secular archaeologists call the oldest temple or oldest religious or cult center in human history. But this is all part of our upcoming tour in October, our very first trip to Turkey. We are working with a company recommended by Doug Hershey, who's the founder of Ezra Adventures, typically a company that runs tours to Israel, but they, during the lockdowns in Israel, started taking people to Turkey. And I was like, oh, well, we do the show Unraveling Revelation. We could go visit the churches of Revelation, but we could also go to Göbekli Tepe and Sanliurfa and Haran, Abraham's hometown. And who better to go with than the two gentlemen who've been doing such intense research on the supernatural influence on Göbekli Tepe, Aaron Judkins and Judd Burton. So they will be joining us when we take this tour October 17th through November 3rd. We've got details at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. And let's talk for a bit about why this is such a fascinating site and how we as Christians process it. Judd, we'll start with you. How does your analysis of this site differ from secular archaeologists?
Well, I think you've hit on the qualifier there, the secular part of that inquiry, and that's not to detract from what the conventional archaeologists that have done the work there. It doesn't detract from the very important and foundational research that they've done. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to Klaus Schmidt, especially, who did so much of the work, was the primary investigator at Göbekli Tepe for almost 3 decades. But outside of the sort of boots on the ground, nuts and bolts interpretation of what happened at Göbekli Tepe, there's not much more that conventional scholarship tells us. It's really kind of the equivalent of just dipping the toe in the supernatural. It's amazing that a lot of the secular scholars will not ascribe any sort of supernatural agency whatsoever to Göbekli Tepe, other than that it was the oldest temple, or that that Göbekli Tepe, the reason for its establishment was not agriculture, as is usually the case with a city-state or civilization, but rather religion. The actual building of the temple was what drew people there, and the agriculture was epiphenomenal. But it's hard to get past what exactly is going on at Göbekli Tepe in the scope of human history, and what a sharp turn it is. It's really a 90-degree angle trajectory change in the culture of humanity, because for the longest time, we were hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists of one sort or another. And in a short window, we would go from roving seasonal villages to building city-states. And now we're learning through sites like Göbekli Tepe and Nobali Chari and Karahan Tepe and Tel Karamal in Syria and Natufi and Jericho in Israel. We're learning that, in fact, city-states existed thousands of years before the traditional contention of the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and the Harappans being the first to build cities.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Can you date Göbekli Tepe for us, those who don't know?
Yeah, the median dating for Göbekli Tepe, according to the work that's been done thus far, is about 10,500 BC.
It's a long time.
So we're talking about the late Pleistocene, just before that. We're coming off of the last ice age. We're just about to transition into the Holocene epoch, which is the one that we're in right now, geologically speaking. But the only time that you see these kinds of drastic, irreversible changes is when you have the meeting of two different divergently is the best way to say it. You have the meeting of two different societies, one of which is highly advanced and sophisticated, often myopic and self-centered in its objects, and typically usurps, harms, and forever changes the culture that it comes into contact with. And I think that's what we're looking at Göbekli Tepe, but we're not looking at another human culture affecting a human culture. And I'll get to this in just a second. But the thing that made me think about this in all of our research was something that Jared Diamond had articulated in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it's certainly articulated in other works and other research. But I think that Diamond does an interesting kind of laboratory experiment with it. And Diamond, of course, is an evolutionary biologist by training, but he's essentially an ethnologist, but because of the way that he popularized this version of world history. And so I don't agree with him on his sort of macroevolutionary ideas, but I think he does bring up some really interesting points by pointing out that when the old world clashed with the new world, that is, in this case, he uses Pizarro and the clash with the Incan king Atahualpa in South America. By that time, when that event happens, there's so much that's transpired in the old world in terms of technology and metallurgy and weaponry and agriculture, and even exposure to things like herd animals and inoculation over time against certain diseases that they carried, like smallpox and anthrax to a certain extent. The very geography of the continents had an effect on how much more advanced in terms of their technology the old worlders were compared to the new world. In other words, the Eurasian continent is long east to west, so it was easier for these things to spread. The Americas are long north to south, so they had to, technology and civilization had to cover basically every environment and every geography that the planet had. So there were thousands of years of stacking the deck in favor of the old world simply because of these other things like geography and epidemiology. And long story short, that's what basically set Spain up to conquer the Inca. And that got me to thinking, well, there's a similar drastic change in human culture that's taking place in prehistoric Turkey because of this. And I think the missing piece that most of the conventional scholarship has is the agency of the people or the culture causing the change. And the only, again, bringing the supernatural into the equation, the only culture that existed at the time that would have been able to do that would have been one from another dimension, specifically the fallen angels that we call the egregori or the watchers today. So Aaron and I have posited that Göbekli Tepe was a watcher outpost.
So this is pre-flood?
Pre-flood.
Mm-hmm.
So Aaron, how did the carvings, the artwork, the pillars that have been discovered at Göbekli Tepe and some of the sites nearby, like Karahan Tepe, how do they support this idea that what you got at Göbekli Tepe is evidence of a clash of
Genesis
cultures?
6.
Yeah, Genesis 6, essentially.
Yeah, so Göbekli Tepe is really a site that is, to put it in the term of what Dr. Judd Burton had recently gone through, baffling. And it's research really shows in the last
inside joke.
An inside joke, by the way, but it has actually it has baffled archaeologists now since the last 3 decades.
Yeah, was this discovered in 93, 94, something like that?
Yeah, the mid-90s, late 90s. It was actually surveyed as early on, I think in the 60s, as a Byzantine cemetery.
Oh,
right.
And they just left it alone. And it wasn't until the farmer who owned that land was plowing, hit a large stone that he couldn't get out of the ground. He tried to dig it out by hand, realized this thing's way too large. He went and got someone. He noticed, these angular sides on it that was man-made. So he went and got help, and then that's how they discovered that this was not a Byzantine cemetery. And then Dr. Schmidt was really the one who came in, who had been excavating in that region, but then had finished that project up. And then he came in to look at this site and realized this is something much more different. And so the research really over the last 3 decades has shown that back in the 9th and 10th millennial BC, that there was a spatial distinction of this sacred space or communal quarters that really shows strong evidence for the beginning of an architectural design that was reserved for a sacred communal space that served a specific ritual function. And so these stones at Göbekli with the iconography on these stones shows anthropomorphic beings that are 18.5 foot tall in a megalithic stone T-column shape. They're faceless, but they have arms, they have a belt, they have a loincloth, their arms are wrapped around close to the navel, and there are 2 central beings in enclosure D, and these are very relevant to what they were doing in these sacred spaces. So the stonework, the iconography, the symbology is all pointing to something very specific they were doing at Göbekli Tepe.
Now, this was ritually buried, or at least it was intentionally buried. Isn't that correct?
Well, that's up for...
That's a theory?
Yeah, it's still being debated. Just because the initial thought was that, yes, it was intentionally buried. I'm not so sure about that. This is a very large site. I think it's some 22 acres.
Mm-hmm. And
there's
it's
other
more
sites.
than one. Yes, exactly. There's more than one mystery temple, if you want to call it that way.
Right. So these other sites, Navali Chori, Çatalhöyük, Karahan Tepe.
These
Yes, Çatalhöyük is on the tour.
Yeah, these particular places, especially the sites more closer to Göbekli Tepe, appear to have been buried. But the question is, were they intentionally buried? Now, initially, the scientists or the archaeologists there at the site said, yes, they were all purposely buried. I'm not so sure about that. There's some debate going on with that right now. How do you intentionally backfill a 22-acre site, and why?
Yeah.
What's the reasoning for that? I think more, if you apply the principle of Ottman's razor to this, I think the more simpler explanation would be that it was not intentionally backfilled, but it was filled in over time. Perhaps this is an area in a region where there is prone to earthquakes, perhaps some kind of a cultural shift happened. They abandoned the site and it filled in over time naturally. We just don't know the answer to that. Both may be true. There may be some aspects of both, because the evidence shows, at least in some of the spatial quarters, what they call the enclosures, and there's multiple enclosures now, but there was things that were placed deliberately on the floor next to these stone pillars, and it looks like they were intentionally placed there and then were buried. The question was the whole site intentionally buried? We just don't know the answer to that yet.
That's really interesting. In the strata that was covering it, those who, Dr. Schmidt, thank you. I want to call him Schultz. Wrong one. Dr. Schmidt and his team, did they discover any strata that appeared to be alluvial? In other words, was this covered by a flood?
I guess I'll answer that. Judd, you can jump in here too. To my knowledge, that answer is no. There's no, geological formations that would indicate that, it was covered in by water and then it was kind of buried in that way. So really, there's a lot of it's a lot of mixture of just topsoil and just other artifacts, points, stone tools, etc., that have been found buried in the site. So we don't know if it was just all thrown into the mix and then buried over. But whatever happened, all this got thrown in there, either purposefully or through a natural means. But all this was just basically covered up over a site and then just left. And so we don't really know the question of why that happened or how it happened. I don't know that it was intentionally backfilled. There's a lot of these areas that are very close to Göbekli, such as Karahan Tepe. It's a sister site to Göbekli. That was buried too. So my reasoning is, how do you, or why do you take a whole region and bury all these sites? Did they have some kind of a common purpose that they did that, and just all of a sudden all of them left at the same time?
The idea of harem.
Yeah.
I would add to that, and I agree with Aaron. I think that the reports thus far attest to the fact that there are no discernible strata within the enclosures that were filled, whatever the mechanism was. It just appears to be soil matrix. It's soil and gravel, essentially. Not that you don't find stuff that let's say is biologically diagnostic in nature, because you're always in dry areas like that. You're always going to find pollen and things like that are going to give you a clue as to what the diet and the ecology and so on and so forth is like. But in terms of the mechanism, it's largely what archaeologists call matrix or soil matrix. And I agree with Aaron. I think that process of time is responsible for at least some of it. But I think that there's also room to include that some places, and Aaron touched on this, in some places you probably do have intentional backfilling. And I think that what we may be looking at in those cases, which have yet to be completely fleshed out. Now, hopefully, Aaron and I can be working on some of those problems in the near future. But I think what we may be looking at is some supernatural buyer's remorse, in that the people that were actually involved in the cult practices at some of these sites realized what they had done a little bit too late, and saw the dangers in trafficking with the watchers.
Maybe they heard a rumor that there was a big flood coming.
Right.
That's a fascinating theory, and we know that there are other examples of that sort of ritual burying taking place. Dr. Michael Freakman, who excavated at Gilgal Rephaim, but also at the site just to the north of there, which we've dubbed the Serpent Mound of Bashan, found that there were dwellings on top of that serpent-shaped ridge that were ritually buried sometime in the 4th millennium BC. The grinding stones were broken, and you really have to work pretty hard to break thick slabs of basalt.
Yeah. I've seen people hit those rocks with pickaxes, and they bounce back and hit them in the head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there was something going on there that caused the folks at that settlement, a quarter of a mile from Gilgal Rephaim, to bury their site. So a lot of work taken to fill in a 22-acre site compared to the site of Gilgal Rephaim. And there's about, I would say 7,000 years difference between those two sites. But it just the point being that there are other examples in the ancient world of this sort of thing taking place. Judd, you've talked before about the Younger Dryas and how that might relate to the biblical flood. How does that all? What time period are we talking about, and how does that relate to what we might find at Göbekli Tepe?
Yeah, the Younger Dryas is this collection of geological events, cataclysmic events that happen right on the tail end of the Pleistocene. So about 9,700 to 9,500 is kind of the window that we're looking at, which is interesting because that lines up also with the date that Plato talks about in Critias and Timaeus about the destruction of Atlantis. But I digress. The Younger Dryas is this series of very, very bizarre but quantified and demonstrable series of geological cataclysms that occur on the planet. Now, it's a time of increased solar activity, so you've got really extreme coronal mass ejections during this period. The sun largely controls weather on the planet, so you can imagine what sort of high strangeness it must have been like to be on planet Earth at the time. In certain places, we know that those coronal mass ejections made it through our protective shielding, the Van Allen belts, and the atmosphere, and actually vitrified surface rock.
My goodness.
So there's that. There's increased seismic and volcanic activity. There's flash freezing, which is why we find megafauna with undigested food in their bellies in some of the colder regions of the planet. There's flash localized flooding all over the planet. We're finding out now that there were likely comet fragments that impacted the Western Hemisphere in North America and caused some torrential flooding because of flash glacial melts. So yeah, it was not a pleasant time to be on planet Earth when all of this was happening. And of course, as this is happening, when you couple that with us coming off of the last ice age, sea levels are starting to rise again at this point in time. And so when you factor all of this into, let's just say generally, I mean, specifically, we talk about the biblical flood epic, But when you take into account the preponderance of flood stories and flood epics that exist literally all over the world in virtually every culture, something happened. Some series of events happened that seared itself into our collective cultural memory so that we still talk about it today, thousands of years later. And I think that there's some really exciting and interesting things going on the scientific front by people who largely have no stake in a supernatural worldview, and yet they're providing more pieces to the puzzle, a broader backdrop to understand something like the Noahic flood. But in essence, that's what's happening during this period the geologists have dubbed the Younger Dryas.
Well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk about the cult of the skull, but also the bull imagery at Göbekli Tepe and how that may relate to or point to the creators of the site as we continue our discussion with Dr. Aaron Jedkins, Dr. Jed Burton on PID Radio.
Prepare for spiritual war by arming yourself with information. Take advantage of these specials through March that dig deep into the Bible to help you make sense of the chaos around us. First, our Veneration Bundle, our 2 co-authored books plus the travelogue DVDs from our Israel tours. An $85 value, just $45 plus shipping and handling. The Second Coming of Saturn Bundle, featuring my book and the 13-part companion DVD, a $50 value for just $35 plus shipping and handling. The This Is War special offer, featuring the Second Coming of Saturn, 4 DVDs, and 7 hours of audio interviews with Bible scholar Dr. Michael Heiser, a $145 value for just $75 plus shipping and handling. And the Gilbert Fiction Collection, all 8 novels in Sharon's Red Wing Saga series plus my 2 novels, a $200 value for just $140 plus shipping and handling. These offers are available through March only at our online store, gilberthouse.org/store. And again, we thank you for your prayers and support.
Welcome back to PID Radio. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I am Sharon Gilbert, and we want to tell you about our plans for October.
We're going to Turkey. Well, actually, we have to be polite. The people of Turkey now say they would prefer Turkey yay. Just think Thanksgiving dinner, turkey yay, and but don't.
Don't spell it that way.
Don't spell it that way.
You have to have a little umlaut over the U,
yes.
and just be polite.
No, if you've been following us for a little while, you know that we had hoped to go this previous October, but out of concerns for security due to what's going on in Ukraine, we decided to hold off a year. But we have found from the tour company that 2022 was actually a record year for tourism in Turkey, and they have also reported that people trying to get away from the conflict in Ukraine, Ukrainians and Russians, are moving to Turkey because it's safe there. So they're very open and welcoming to Western tourists. Obviously, they benefit from the money that we spend in their country. But there are so many sites that have biblical relevance. The churches of Revelation. There's a reason that when Jesus dictated those letters to John the Revelator, they were directed to the sites in Western Turkey, and we will visit all of those locations, including Pergamum, where we will visit the Asclepion, which we talked about with Vicki Joy Anderson, author of They Only Come Out at Night.
Go to the Gates of Hell.
Gates of Hell, the Plutonion. And church at Ephesus, of course, very important. In fact, if schedule holds, we'll be in Ephesus on your birthday.
My birthday, yeah. I know. Isn't that exciting?
But then we'll also visit sites in the eastern part of the country that many tours don't visit, like Mount Nemrut and the giant idols of Nemrut from the ancient the ancient kingdom. And I'm going to forget the name of the king and the kingdom now.
Urartu?
No, it wasn't Urartu. That had already folded by then. Well, I'll think of it. Commagene, I think. Commagene.
Yes, I think you are right. And it's sort of, I think the king sort of connected himself to Gilgamesh. To Nimrod.
It's sort of a...
Nimrut.
Right, Mount Nimrut. Yeah, it's a sort of a mashup of Iranian...
It's got a whole bunch of gods up there, and they've all been beheaded.
Yeah, it is absolutely stunning We'll also visit Arslan Tepe, which is the northernmost outpost of the kingdom of Uruk, which is the kingdom of Nimrod.
Yes.
Which was then, when it fell, when the kingdom of Uruk fell, it transferred over to the Hurrian people, whom we've talked about, with, did a deep dive into them in my book, Second Coming of Saturn.
Didn't Hike claim that he was the one who killed Nimrod?
Hike, who was the father of Armenia, supposed to have killed Nimrod somewhere in that region. Mm-hmm. So, but we'll also visit Haran, Abraham's hometown, Sanliurfa or Urfa, which may well be the Ur of the Chaldees.
We're going to stay in a cave hotel.
Oh, yes, in Cappadocia. We'll visit some of the underground cities of Cappadocia, which were, they date back to the 7th century BC, but they were used by Christians from the 1st century through the 8th century, hiding from the Romans and later hiding from the Muslims. And some of these cities are just absolutely huge, 35,000 people, plus their livestock. And the hotel, 4 nights in an underground hotel. Mm-hmm. So you get information and a look at the itinerary through our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. And, of course, our special guests who are with us today as we discuss this, Dr. Aaron Judkins and Dr. Judd Burton, as they will be sharing their research on Göbekli Tepe on location.
On location. The 2 doctors are going with us, and they're going to share their knowledge, which is extensive, about all of the various sites, but especially about those archaeological sites.
Mm-hmm. This will be a relatively small tour. We're trying to keep it to 2 dozen or thereabouts. So find out more, and if you're so led, go ahead and put down a deposit. And we hope to see you in See you in Turkey.
Go to gilberthouse.org/travel, and the links will be there to tell you all about the tour.
Yes. Aaron, one of the things that we really found mind-blowing, and we're only going to scratch the surface of what you guys have been researching here in the course of this, hour program or thereabouts. The 2 things. I first want
teased them.
Yeah, want to get into the cult of the skull because there are a couple of connections here. Chayanu, which was near Göbekli Tepe, they found a skull building, and recently it was reported that on what appears to be the altar at that skull building, human blood. So I think
when you say skull building, you mean filled with skulls, or looked like a skull?
Well, no, because human skulls were found there.
That's what I'm saying.
And then blood on the altar.
That's not good.
That's not good. But then also at Çatalhöyük, which is another site in southern Turkey, 350 burials, and they found that a number of them, and you mentioned this in your book, Aaron, that 18 had their heads removed after burial, up to a year after burial. And we know from the Neolithic, say at Jericho, that skulls were venerated. They were decorated, plastered, and kept as votive objects.
As if the connection to the dead ancestor was in the skull.
Right. So what's the deal? How does this all connect to Göbekli Tepe in that region?
Yeah, so the skull cult. This is a time period of the Neolithic, pre-pottery Neolithic, and the preservation of the head was considered sacred. It was the part of the body that was most often preserved, as you said, the comparable sites at Jericho, also at Ain Gezel, Çatalhöyük, and Navali Chori. There is comparable imagery from these sites that could basically link a concept of this skull cult that basically is a concept of life after death. So, as you said, 350 burials. These basically were the heads were severed, and then after 1 year, they removed those heads, but they usually buried them under the homes of the floors. And as you said, over in Jericho and at Ain Gezel, they would take those heads and they would plaster them because bone begins to disintegrate. And so they would take mud and plaster, and then they would take shell, or in some cases obsidian, for the eyes and place them inside the skull.
That's creepy. Black obsidian, shiny black eyes.
Yeah, this is what we see I think with Urfa Man, that they discovered there near Shanlurfa. It's a 5'10" statue that's contemporary with Göbekli Tepe. But, it's a veneration that they decorated these skulls to resemble the life of that person or the living. So I think what happened is as they took these skulls out, probably once a year or once a month, we don't really know, but they had some kind of a venerated act that they would do with that. Now, I know there's cultures today down in South and Central America that still venerate their dead, but they do it with the whole body. This is the same idea, but they take these skulls, remove them from their carefully buried pit, usually under the home, and then they would, somehow, through some sort of custom, they would take and honor this particular person and then put them back. They wanted to keep them close. Now, how does that relate to Göbekli Tepe? Initially, archaeologists told us Göbekli Tepe was a place where they came and then they left. There was not a site that was inhabited. That view has changed now. Just more recently, I think, as of November 2022, they did discover 3 burials under the floors at Göbekli Tepe. And there's probably going to be more, but there were 3 human burials that was very similar in how the other sites had also buried their dead. And we're not talking just the skull fragments that were placed inside the enclosures. These are full human burials that they found. I think 2 were female, 1 was male, and they were discovered under a rectangular building, which is adjacent to the enclosures. And so I don't think that they would have buried their dead at Göbekli had they not lived there. And evidence is now showing that they actually lived and inhabited this site. So what's the purpose of doing that? Initially, archaeologists thought maybe there were sky burials, and that basically took the large, birds of the air that would come, vultures, et cetera, and they would, eat the flesh, and then their spirits would be carried away. It seems like at least part of that may not be true, as these recent, development of the burials were discovered under the floors. And with the skull cult, and with the relation of the sister sites that had been found, that's adjacent to the region of Göbekli Tepe. Why would you take a bunch of skulls and have them under the floor or in your in the area of where you live? So it seems strange to me, because again, this gets back to an area of, were they venerating their dead ancestors, or were they using these skulls as part of a ritualistic cult that paid homage back to the gods of the underworld?
Yeah, the skull building at the Chayanu, by the way, 70 skulls had been found there in the antechambers around the building, 70. hence the name. But, Judd, very quickly, the Urfa Man, and I'm going to show an image that Aaron included in his book here. I'm going to show it to Sharon anyway. When you look at it, if you essentially take off the head, that Urfa Man looks a lot like the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It's got those crazy, 1980s dynasty padded shoulders.
The padded shoulders with the V-neck.
Right.
Is there a connection there between them? I mean, we were discussing this earlier as we were watching a documentary. I guess we'll put that in air quotes.
Eye roll.
Yeah, from a prominent person with the UFO ET hypothesis, ancient aliens thing. wondering, okay, would there have been heads originally on those T-shaped pillars? Now, it doesn't look like it because the tops look really clean, but it does look like the rest of the anthropomorphic shape of that Urfa man is very similar to the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and that's the kind of anthropomorphism that you see in that's shared between a number of these sites and that let's say cultural complex. There are other symbols that seem to pop up, and I know that Aaron has written pretty extensively on this in the sections of his book that he put in Guardians of Göbekli. But the chevrons are another example. The so-called cultural purse symbol. That the culture heroes seem to carry around with them, not just in the ancient prehistoric Near East, but all over the world. Also seems to be part of the cultural complex there in southeastern Turkey. But clearly the agents that the occupants of Göbekli Tepe were venerating were anthropomorphic and something otherworldly. And as you guys and Aaron were talking about the skull cult, this cult of the dead, it occurs to me that if we sort of zoom out and take a more meta look at this site at Göbekli Tepe and the sites that are associated with it, what one of the things that we're starting to see when we sort of compare each of these sites is that what is clearly happening at Göbekli Tepe is the trafficking with otherness, with some sort of supernatural agency. And even if you look at the literature that's been produced by the archaeologists thus far, notably the late Klaus Schmidt, even these guys will concede that the people that built Göbekli Tepe, that worshipped at Göbekli Tepe, clearly thought of this place as a portal to the netherworld. Mm-hmm. And I think that's key in understanding what's going on here. It informs diagnostically finds like the slightly older in terms of its discovery, Urfa man, but also the collection of perennial symbols that we find in this collection of sites.
That reminds me of something that Jed just said I wanted to bring up in the research that I've done on Guardians of Göbekli about the portal link at Göbekli. In the book that I just came out with, Guardians of Göbekli, and this part of a larger work that Dr. Burton and I are putting together that will be hopefully be published this year. But the iconography on these stones, I think, is not just artistic motifs. I think this is a language that is called Anatolian hieroglyphic, more specifically a Luvian logogram. And a logogram is an idea or a concept that equals a word.
Did you just say this is Luvian?
Luvian.
Oh my goodness, Luwian.
Yeah, they were.
Yes, we've been studying the Luvians for a while now. I wasn't aware that the language there was related to.
Well, that's part of the research in the book that I get into is these artistic motifs language. And I think the answer to that is there's a real possibility that this is Anatolian hieroglyphic language by the Luvians. And one of these stones, basically in Eastern Pillar 18 in enclosure D, we find that there's these H type symbols with brackets around them, like parentheses, if you will. In this particular representation of what we would think of an English letter for H is actually the Luwian hieroglyphic logogram for portal.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, doesn't that blow your mind?
Yes.
Let me tell you something else. In Pillar 48, in enclosure C, we have the symbol, the Luwian logogram symbol for Deus, and at the bottom of that is a symbol which looks like an I, which also represents the word for temple.
Oh my goodness.
So loosely translated, if we could transliterate that into English, what these stones are saying in hieroglyphic language, in the Anatolian hieroglyphic language, is that this is the gate or the portal of the gods. And that's exactly what Dr. Burton has been hypothesizing about this particular site with the Watchers outpost. This is exactly what we see in the language of the stones. This is precisely what we're seeing in the iconography of these anthropomorphic T-shaped pillars. And the whole story comes together that Göbekli Tepe is actually not what they've told us in the very beginning of the evolution of civilization. It didn't happen like that at all. As a matter of fact, it's exactly the opposite of what Jed Burton has said. It's the paradigm that's changing the paradigm. That's exactly what this site is doing, because it's exactly the opposite in archaeology. The evidence, the empirical evidence is showing us that this is not a result of a cultural evolution that started with people coming together through agriculture, forming, these communities, and then farming happened. And then as a result of all that, then religion developed. Göbekli Tepe is showing us that religious thought occurred first, that brought the people together, supposedly as Stone Age people, before the invention of writing and the invention of the wheel, but came together in large groups to basically carve these huge megalithic stones from a quarter of a mile away, 20 tons and more, drag them up the hill, and then create these megalithic structures on top of this 22-acre site. It shows a division of labor. It shows organization. It shows an advanced knowledge of mathematics and engineering and architecture. How does a Stone Age man do all that?
Exactly. And it also shows organization. There has to have been someone or a group of someones at the top organizing everything and enforcing it.
A social hierarchy.
Yeah.
Precisely. And that's exactly what we see at Göbekli Tepe. That's exactly what we're seeing in the region. And it all links back to the Watchers.
Oh, my goodness.
This is one of the aspects of your book, Aaron, that I found most fascinating, and why, when you guys collate your research and put it out together, it's going to be a must-have for our research library, but also why I think people should be excited about joining us on this tour, where you can point, say, okay, that pillar there, that's the one where we've got what appears to be an Anatolian logogram, a Proto-Luwian alphabet, or not alphabet, but form of writing, logogram, and especially if you're correct about your interpretation here, house of the moon god or house of the bull god.
Yes.
Because as I found in my research over the years into Kronos, Saturn, Kumarbi, the Hurrian edition, and Hurrians occupied this area from about 3500 BC down to the destruction of the kingdom of Mitanni around 1200 BC. This appears to be ground zero for that old god Saturn, Kronos, Baal-Hamon, Enlil, Kumarbi. Seems to come from that area of southeast Turkey, northern Syria. That's his home turf. The city of Urkesh, which is now on the Syrian side of the Turkish border, a little east of this site, southeast of Göbekli Tepe, was known to be the city of Kumarbi. And he was supposed to be at home in the mountains, the Taurus Mountains just to the north of there, closer to in the direction of Ararat, where the Hurrian people originated, and brought with them this idea that you had to summon spirits from the netherworld. So you get this post-flood memory that there were gods who once walked among us who are now in the netherworld, and we've got to summon them from. We've got to dig this.
You need
really
a portal.
Pit. You need a portal. And so their ritual pit was a more recent version of this site at Göbekli Tepe to somehow commune with the gods. The gods used to walk among us. Now they're in the netherworld. We need to bring them up and summon them. But then we need to send them back.
Well, I would say the Tower of Babel was an echo of what we see at Göbekli Tepe.
Agreed.
Exactly. Yeah. This is so exciting. And I'll let Judd jump in here. I'm excited because, one, archaeologists are now recognizing the sites around Göbekli Tepe. There's other sites, and we've already talked about them, Karahan Tepe and others, Sogmatar. These are areas that have been clearly identified with moon worship.
Mm-hmm. Haran.
Now, that's interesting because that's what I'm saying happened at Göbekli Tepe. There was deity worship. Maybe this is the earliest form of that. We don't know yet. Certainly, we don't have any specific names, although it could be related to the moon god Sin, which comes much later. But perhaps this is an earlier form. Mm-hmm. But what I love about all this is that Dr. Burton's work, your work, and my work has all coming together, and it's showing a larger picture. I think what's happening in this region. That's what I'm so excited about. Getting over to this area with you in October.
I think Aaron's spot on. I think the language work that he's done here is more evidence supporting this idea that the site itself was a portal, and the agency at work here were the Watchers. And now, Sharon, you brought up something really interesting that you referenced the Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly what we're looking at Göbekli Tepe, and I'll tell you why. I think that this is a let's say a supernatural military campaign on the same order. Now, taking into account that these fallen entities had control of vast amounts of knowledge, but they still didn't have the perspective that God did, that Yahweh did. So they were working off of an incomplete picture. But if we're to go off of the idea that Eden, the country and the garden that was in it, was in Turkey, that it was somewhere near the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris, even though there's some debate as to the location and what the other rivers were that converged and or rather diverged as they went out of Eden. What the Watchers knew is that there were cherubim guarding the gate at Eden. And Eden was, the garden itself was this strange place where heaven and earth touched. You have two realms touching. My contention is that the Watchers were fully aware of this. They were going to do anything that they possibly could to weaponize this, and so they thought that they could either overpower the angel that was guarding the gate at Eden and somehow weaponize Eden to launch an assault on heaven, or they thought that they would be successful in persuading the guardian to joining their part, to becoming part of the satanic coup in order to assault heaven. Failed attempt, but I think that the pieces of the puzzle are in place so that argument makes sense when you take both the physical evidence that the archaeologists have produced and you plug in the supernatural divine counsel worldview into that equation.
Boy, I think you're spot on there. And I've often told people to read Milton's Paradise Lost. He wasn't perfect in his theology, but he writes the characters and their military actions. I think he came very, very close to what actually has happened and continues to happen to this day.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And besides, you should read Milton anyway. It's it's a seminal volume in Western culture. You need to read Milton.
Oh, yeah, amen.
She's been reminding me that I need to do that for a long time, and I keep going back to Godzilla movies.
Vicki Anderson has her own version of that.
Yes, actually, she wrote it in
more modern English,
but rhyming.
in the style.
Yeah,
exactly.
but so it rhymes now, so it's poetry. So yeah,
it's sort of a slog reading. But once you get used to the original Milton, but once you start reading it and you get down to that rhythm, it's like Shakespeare. It's easy.
Well. In the interest of keeping this to a manageable length, because I know we've only scratched the surface here, but hopefully we've teased your interest, listener, for this site and its relevance as in the history of the supernatural war that is described in the Bible.
A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a bucket list trip to Turkey, to Türkiye with us. If you've already been to Israel and you're thinking, okay, I could go back to Israel, or no, if you love archaeology, if you want to see the experience what it was like for those first century church believers to get those letters, to stand in their shoes, so to speak. If you want to see Göbekli Tepe for yourself, if you want to see the Hagia Sophia, which is an amazing church that sadly has become a mosque, but you can still see the bones of the original Byzantine church and understand why Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, was so important. You need to go with us.
Yeah, lots of fascinating things here. The underground cities of Cappadocia. Doug Hershey pointed out that one of the letters of Peter's addressed to the church in Cappadocia, and those early believers who may have been hiding from the Romans at that point may have been using those caves and reading that, the copies of Peter's letter in the first century in those underground, because there are underground churches in those underground cities.
And we will read that while we're down there. Yes.
So much more information available at the website, gilberthouse.org/travel. To follow the work of Drs. Judkins and Burton, visit aaronjudkins.com and burtonbeyond.com. There will be links in the show notes and also a link to Aaron's book, The Guardians of Göbekli. And fellows, we are looking forward to your joint book, but also getting to Turkey and visiting these sites as with you fellows. This will be quite an adventure.
Well, I think that there's some exciting research taking place right now. Like Aaron pointed out, it's amazing how all of our respective research agendas have just dovetailed over the last decade, and we seem to be pulling at strands of the same unraveling tapestry. I'm just excited to be part of it.
Me too. And, getting back over to these areas that I had missed back in 2013 when I was climbing Mount Ararat in search for Noah's Ark. I didn't get to go to Göbekli or Cappadocia or Ephesus. So this is all going to be new for me. I've always wanted to do something like this, but to see it in a bucket list type of itinerary with the combined research and the knowledge that Sharon and Derek is going to bring to the trip as well, just to get to hang out with both of you two and Dr. Burton, that is going to be so exciting for me, and to have a shared experience like this. This is going to be one of my most memorable expeditions. So I'm so looking forward to it, and we invite every one of you to come along and join us as we make this, I think, historic and exciting trip that we have planned out for you.
Well put. Again, information on the website, gilberthouse.org/travel. Please remember to take advantage of our free app, gilberthouse.org/app. All of our content, including all of our previous interviews with Aaron and Judd, are archived there in the various tabs. And until next time, I'm Derek Gilbert.
I'm Sharon Gilbert. Bye-bye, everybody.
PID Radio is an outreach of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Follow us online, PIDradio.com, Twitter @PID Radio, or by downloading our free app, PIDradio.com/app or gilberthouse.org/app. Join us each week for our Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship.